But I want to move on and talk a little bit about what I did this week, what videos I posted on YouTube. So I kind of, last week I focused a lot on Bob Dylan, and this week I decided to kind of give Bob Dylan a rest, because I think too much of Bob is not a good thing. You may disagree with that, but I feel like too much of any musician is probably any single musician is not a good thing. I like variety. Variety is the spice of life. And Bob, let's face it, no, we all know he's the best. There you go. best singer-songwriter of his ilk. But it gets a little boring to hear too much of Bob. And I'm sure he would agree. He would be the first to say, "Yeah, man, totally." So I do like to switch it up, and so I went back to I was digging into some older songs that I've played in the past and kind of relearning them or reviewing them. But I'm also starting to get into Leonard Cohen, posting more Leonard Cohen songs. And I've been a fan of Leonard Cohen ever since I was in my, say, early 20s. When I first started learning guitar, one of the songs that I tried to learn was Suzanne. So I do have a Leonard Cohen, somewhere back there, I have a Leonard Cohen finger-picking book that I was learning from. And I don't know, last year I started digging deeper into Leonard Cohen. I hadn't really been paying a lot of attention to his subsequent work since his early stuff in the 60s, which I know relatively well. But obviously there's Hallelujah, a song that everybody knows, which I've played many times over the years. But that's kind of exceptional. I think that's the one song of his that kind of broke out into the mainstream and is kind of recognized by people all around the world, since so many others have covered that song. But I think most Leonard Cohen songs are still relatively obscure. If you're not a Leonard Cohen fan, you're probably not going to know these songs. They don't get a lot of radio airplay. His voice is a little off-putting. It's a little monotonous, I think. It's just very deep and low. And of course, there are people who love his voice, and I'm among them. But I think, just objectively speaking, his voice and his delivery is a bit monotonous. His lyrics are profound, but they take a lot of effort. It's like reading poetry. They don't like smack you in the face with their meaning. You really have to listen to them many times. You have to think about them. Or in my case, I've read many books about Leonard Cohen recently to try to understand his work better, understand the connection to strains of different religions, different belief systems that he may have subscribed to or delved into. I mean, he had an interesting background, right? Because he was obviously born and raised in a Jewish family and very steeped in Jewish religion and perhaps you could say philosophy as a young man, but also has in-depth knowledge of Christianity and the Bible, a lot of biblical references in his songs. But then later on, he kind of discovered Buddhism and became a Zen monk, and actually lived for several years in a Zen retreat outside of Los Angeles, and followed a Japanese Zen Buddhist monk. Actually was his driver for a while. So he had a very interesting he has a very mixed, eclectic sort of religious background that then kind of mingles with his secular side, you could say, his love for life's pleasures, which I think are also a deep part of his songs as well, and of his life story. So yeah, I find Leonard Cohen a really fascinating person, a very profound writer, poet, and and songwriter, and kind of in a way, kind of an antidote. Dylan is like I don't want to call him the anti-Bob, the way we talk about like the Rolling Stones being the anti-Beatles. I wouldn't say he's the anti-Bob, but he's a bit of an antidote to Bob. He's sort of, Bob Dylan, with his stream of consciousness, with his just brilliant poetic mind, going in directions that you never imagined, but then kind of deeply rooted in storytelling, in the American folk tradition. And then Leonard Cohen, I would say, you could say that his tradition is less American and more European. He was born and raised in Canada, went to college in Montreal. So he has more of maybe a continental outlook and education. Spent a lot of time in the Mediterranean on that island of Hydra. I'm very envious of that. I would like to spend some time on a Mediterranean island, but that hasn't been my fate. So I think, Leonard Cohen has a more, European approach. It's maybe a little bit closer to the folk traditions of, when I think of like the great Parisian singers, Jacques Brel, who's the guy? Aznavour. God damn, it's hard to remember his name. Aznavour. Charles Aznavour, who wrote the song that becomes She and other songs. Kind of, just maybe a somewhat more jaded, sophisticated approach to songwriting, and less American. This is just kind of spur of the moment thoughts. I'm just trying to think about how Dylan and Cohen connect with each other, how they differ. Obviously, they knew each other. Cohen was older than Dylan. Dylan's born in 41, is it? Cohen is born in 36, so he was a few years older, but he kind of came into the songwriting, into the singer-songwriter thing a little bit later in his life. I think he was in his 30s. So they both kind of emerged in the same era in the 1960s, but Cohen was definitely more of a worldly person than Bob Dylan when he started his career as a songwriter. He'd already been a you could say an accomplished poet, recognized poet. He'd already spent several years living in Europe, living abroad. So I think Cohen kind of comes into the relationship with maybe a little bit more sophistication. Dylan is the younger man, just making a name for himself, and I think ever since the two of them emerged, there's just been constant comparisons between the two. As we know, Dylan is by far the more prolific songwriter. Cohen wrote fewer songs, but I think he spent a lot more time crafting each song. There's that famous conversation they had over coffee or something where Dylan asks Cohen, how long did it take to write Hallelujah? And Cohen's like, 7 years, and that's pretty well documented. There's a documentary film about that. There's books about the development of Hallelujah as a song. And it did take him years to craft those lyrics with a lot of rewrites and dozens of verses that never made it into the final versions of the lyrics. Whereas I think Dylan was much more of a intuitive songwriter. He could write a song in 20 minutes. And it still had a profundity to it, but it definitely didn't have the careful thought and attention that Leonard Cohen's songs have. So I do find it kind of antidotal to, after working on Dylan for a spell, to turn to Leonard Cohen and work on some of his songs and his songwriting style and his poetic style. But I also see it as kind of a conversation between two of the great songwriters of our age. So, yeah, last week I laid down a few of his songs, some that I've learned more recently, some that I've known for many years. Story of Isaac, that's one of the songs that has, obviously, it's based on the biblical story of Abraham and Isaac and God asking Abraham to sacrifice his son. Interestingly, Dylan also wrote a song with the same, at least mentions, mentions that story in his song. He doesn't focus the song on the story, but he, as Dylan tends to do, he drops it. He kind of name drops that story into his song. So two men who are in their own ways obsessed with biblical stories, obsessed with the Judaic tradition that both of them come from, but also with Christianity, the tensions between the Judaic, the Old Testament and the New Testament, how that kind of shapes our Western civilization. And yeah, that's I feel that's a very, I think it starts out as a very profound story, and then it turns into more of a warning about war, about who is sacrificed and so forth. And then there's this other song, "If It Be Your Will," which seems kind of like almost like a solemn prayer, and that's a later song of Leonard Cohen's. "By the River's Dark," even later. I think that's from his early 2000s album. So yeah, I'm kind of dipping into the Leonard Cohen anthology and pulling out songs that I like and playing them. And at the same time, like I said, I kind of rediscovered this 9-string guitar, and so I decided to play a few old songs that I know and love, see how they feel on this guitar. One was "Solitary Man," which Neil Diamond wrote it, but I'm familiar with the Johnny Cash version. And from his, I think, American series, that's such a wonderful series at the end of his life when he recorded all those songs by other songwriters. I'll probably play a lot more of those later. And I think I started with John Barleycorn, the folk tune by Traffic, which is based on an Old English folk song about basically the making of barley corn used to make whiskey, spirits. That's a clever song that they remade into this beautiful folk song. And then I just happened to be reading one of E. Cummings' books of poetry, and I came across this poem, "My Father Moved Through Dooms of Love," and I was just inspired to, on the spur of the moment, to kind of turn that into a song. So I put it up there, for better or worse. It strikes me as kind of the kernel of a song that could be more developed, but it's kind of hard to turn poetry, real poetry, into songs. They have a different logic to them, songwriting and poetry. But it can be done, and it's been done with some famous poems in the past. And then, of course, I wanted to wish George Harrison a happy birthday. I always try to remember the Beatles' birthdays, and honor their birthdays by at least playing a song that was written by any of them. Although I don't usually celebrate Ringo's birthday much. Ringo's kind of the exception, I guess, just because he didn't write many songs for the Beatles, and he's not really known as a songwriter. But when it comes to George's birthday, February 25, or Paul's birthday on June 18, or John Lennon's birthday on October 9, I like to play a song to commemorate them. So I chose this song "Run of the Mill," which is from his album "All Things Must Pass," his first huge solo album after the Beatles breakup, three albums in one. And I just like the style of that song. I like the chord changes, and it's kind of an homage to the Beatles and their breakup. So I thought that was kind of appropriate. Yeah, so that's pretty much it for my week on YouTube. So hope you enjoyed my thoughts and reflections, as off the cuff as they may be. Maybe there's something to them. Always happy to hear comments from people who are listening out there. And yeah, see you next time.